I think we'll go ahead and call us to order here. So my name is Aaron Weinschenk. I'm the chair of the political science program at UW Green Bay, and really excited for you to be here and be a part of this discussion on some of the current and future challenges in our democracy. Before I introduce you to our panelists, and they were already circulating the room, introducing themselves, so you've met them already probably, but I just wanted to take a moment to thank a few people and groups who supported this. First, this event is being co-sponsored by UWGB and Keep Our Republic. They're a nonpartisan civic action organization that's interested in protecting a republic of laws and strengthening the checks and balances in our system. And I especially want to thank Ari Middleman, their executive director, who's sitting down here in the front. It's been a real pleasure to work with him and his organization on some of these really important questions. And I also wanted to thank some folks at UWGB, some of whom are here. Dean Chuck Ryback has been really supportive of this event. Ryan Martin, who's sitting down here, has been instrumental in some of the logistical items. The Provost's office and the Chancellor's office have all been really encouraging. So really want to thank them for their support and their assistance. Now we'll get to the fun part where you get to meet our panelists and we dive into some of the questions. So first, sitting right next to me is Congressman Dick Gephardt. Congressman Gephardt served for 28 years in the House of Representatives, representing Missouri's 3rd District, which is home to his birthplace of St. Louis. He served as the House Democratic leader for more than 14 years, as House Majority Leader from 1989 to 1995, and as Minority Leader from 1995 to 2003. And he's currently the president and CEO of Gephardt Group, which provides strategic counsel on federal government relations and domestic and international labor relations issues. And he came here from a much warmer place, so he's not enjoying the snow very much. But maybe he'll warm up to it. He likes it. Florida's better though. And then down at the end we have Congressman Reed Ribble, who's probably a familiar face to many of you. He served for 6 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. During his tenure, he served on the Agriculture, Transportation, Infrastructure, Budget and Finance, and Foreign Affairs committees, and he was also the chair of the Committee on Emerging Threats. I think this is really cool. During his time in Congress, he met with more than 25 heads of state, and in his capacity on the Committee on Foreign Relations, he traveled extensively throughout Eastern Europe and the Middle East. I also wanted to mention that Reed is our inaugural practitioner in residence as of about 1 month ago, so he's going to be engaging more formally with the university and things like this, giving guest lectures, which he did yesterday in one of my classes, and something I know he's really excited about, helping students learn about and connect to careers in government and politics. So really want to thank him for coming to this and for serving in that role for a couple of years. So what I thought we would do is I'll ask some questions of the panelists for about half the time, 45 minutes or so, and then we really want to make this interactive, and so I'm going to jump out into the audience with a microphone, and you can ask them any questions that you have for the remaining part of the time. Does that sound good? Okay, so think about your questions, jot them down, remember them, type them up on your phone. So I want to start with like a pretty broad question, and we touched on these a little bit, so I kind of know what they think about these. I had the pleasure of having dinner with them before this event, so I got to pick their brains a little bit. But I was wondering if each of you could highlight some of the key changes you've observed in American politics. And I was going to say for like the past 10 years, but I think you can take it back as far as you want. And they can be positive or negative changes. What are some things that you see on the landscape that have really stood out as important changes?
Well, first, thank you for being here. Thank you, Aaron, for setting all this up. It's a great honor to be at this great institution and to meet all of you who came in on a cold night to listen to us. And I'm also honored to be with my friend Reed Ribble, who I didn't serve with, but I have great admiration for. He was really served in the same spirit that I tried to serve, which was solving problems for the people that I was asked to represent. And that's what he did in his whole time, and that's what we're still hoping for and trying to get done. It's a great question and a hard question, and I've thought a lot about it. I was in Congress from 1977 until 2004. And I've racked my brain the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years, what's changed in our country, in our politics, from when I was in it? And I'd say when I was in it, it was always really hard. Democracy is really hard because our ancestors, the founders, insisted at the federal level that we have 535 people in the room to make decisions on behalf of all the rest of us. Not one. In 1789, the idea that people could govern themselves was nutty. It was radical. No other country in the world had that. They had kings that made all the decisions for all their subjects. But our founders decided that we could do this ourselves. And so I always understood that if Congress or the state legislature or the city council, whatever it was going to be successful, the people elected to be representatives to those bodies had to be able to work together to find compromises, because the disagreement is with everything. The people disagree pretty much on everything. So, can that work? I saw it work. And it was a different time. People were not hateful of one another in my district. They disagreed on everything. I'd have town hall meetings like this. I'd have all the pro-abortion, the anti-abortion, the pro-gun, the anti-gun, the pro-spending more money, the pro-not spending more money. I had it all. And people would get up and shout at me about my votes, but they were always civil. They were always respectful of one another. When I got to Congress, I found my Republican colleagues were respectful of me. I was respectful of them. I wanted to listen to them. I wanted to learn from them because I knew I didn't know everything. I knew what I knew. I didn't know what they knew. So I had to listen to them. So maybe I was there in the golden age of democracy. I don't know. But I do know it was really hard. And I saw a lot of tough compromises get put together on Social Security and on balancing the budget and on immigration policy and on everything you can think of, healthcare, education. And on every one of those compromises that I worked on, at the end of it, everybody was unhappy. That's the definition of a compromise. If anybody's happy, it's not a compromise. But, and this is the big but, even though a lot of people in the country were angry at that outcome, that compromise, they hated it. They were willing to grudgingly put up with it and live with it because they thought the process by which we had made the decision was fair. Their views were represented. They had a vote. They didn't win. They were unhappy about that. But they could see there might be another vote on it down the road. I call it the magic of democracy. I am in awe of it still today. When the problem solvers, which didn't exist when I was there, but he set up in Congress, got the infrastructure bill done, a year ago? I was cheering. They did it, and it only happened because of the problem solvers. Let me tell you, it would not have happened without the problem solvers. They got it done for us, for all of us. So it's a much harder situation now for people to operate in that. And I guess my greatest worry is if Congress is dysfunctional and can't make any decisions, which kind of they're getting toward, then we're all going to give up on it. And we'll say, let's have one person make the decisions. And you're not going to like that. Trust me. You will not like that. You may think this is a mess. That's catastrophic. So a lot's changed. We can talk more about the changes that I see, but I'll leave it at that, and I want to hear from Reed.
Well, thanks, Dick. I want to start with a positive. The 2020 presidential election drew more people to vote at the polls than any time in U.S. history. A shockingly large number of people came to the polls. And so people are engaged like never before. I think that's a real positive. And the more people that we can get to vote, to actually come out and make a statement. Dick talked about making people sovereign. It's not individually sovereign, but the population, the public, is sovereign in our system. They get to have their day of reckoning. They get to have their day of choice. They get to choose. And I will tell you, my observation is that most elected members of Congress are the most courageous the day after the election. And they're the most fearful the day before. And they ought to be, because it's the only day that the sovereign are actually fully in charge. They get to say who is going to be their representative or their president. It's an amazing thing to watch. And so it's something that absolutely must be protected. But I'm optimistic about this because so many people are engaged. Without all the talk, set aside all the talk about, suppression of elections and all that. The state of Georgia, they were accused of trying to suppress the vote in 2022 in midterms, and yet more people voted in Georgia in 2022 than did in 2020 after this bill was passed. The idea is the American people are engaged like never before. This is a positive thing. On the negative side, part of the dysfunction that we're seeing, to the degree that you see dysfunction there, part of that dysfunction is driven by social media and by the ability of misinformation and disinformation to move at the speed of light. It's incredible how much information is out there for people to read that's just not true. And so that becomes a major challenge. But I think of some of the things that happened when Congressman Gephardt was in office, in a divided Congress with a president in the White House that was not of the same party. He talked about Social Security reform. That happened when President Reagan was in office. President Reagan raised the gas tax. Now you stop and think about how difficult it would be to do this today. He did immigration reform. We have a crisis on our southern border, but no one in Washington is actually talking about what the real solution to immigration reform is. And that's improving the legal processes whereby people can come here. Not cutting legal immigration like happened over the last 6 years, where 2.6 million people were restricted from coming legally. It's astounding when you look at the list of successes of the Congress and President during the Reagan time, how consequential it was. Today, you can't even talk about Social Security without one side or the other demagoguing it immediately, or both sides saying you can't talk about this at all. Well, these programs, the actuaries that manage these programs, the directors of both CBO and OMB are all telling us that these programs are the trust funds are going insolvent. There must be something done between Medicare and Social Security. But at the highest levels of government, people are saying you can't touch it. And yet Ronald Reagan was able to completely reform it with a divided Congress, and sometimes with a unified Congress. It was an amazing record to deal with some of the biggest issues that today The Congress seems totally incapable of dealing with it. And I remember coming home many times when I was in Congress, and those of you in the room that know me, you know that I'm a Republican, and I would have folks, particularly on the harder right, accuse me of compromising a principle, and I would tell them I've never compromised a principle. But what I have done is I've sought principled compromise, and I think this is a missing component of what's going on today, is the ability to seek out a principled compromise to move the country forward. I ran for Congress on the novel idea that a $12 trillion debt was too large. And here I am, literally just 10 years removed from when I ran for Congress for the first time, and the debt is almost triple that. And so there are very, very difficult decisions that are coming to us. And we're going to have to figure out a path forward. But I do believe that the Congress today is more dysfunctional than when I was there. And listen, I believe that legislating should be hard work. It should take time, and it should be deliberative, and it should be slow moving in part so that you get it right. But there is a difference between being slow moving and being at a complete standstill. And we have to find collectively together, we must demand more from the people that are seeking to represent us. The core is a people problem, and that has to be fixed at some point. Aaron?
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up on something Reed mentioned. You mentioned social media. You and I, and we talked about this over dinner, we've talked a lot about social media and the spread of misinformation. We've probably all seen the post-truth phrase out there and concern about misinformation. And I was wondering if each of you could talk a little bit about why you think things that like empirical evidence shows just didn't happen, people believe them with absolute certainty. Why does that happen? Why does it spread, or where did it come from in the first place?
Well, let me start this. You have to, I've thought a lot about this because I think it's one of the significant factors that's changed the whole country since I was in office. And so I began to investigate it. I called people that knew more about it than I did. I called Tristan Harris, who did the Social Dilemma video you may have seen on, I think it was on Netflix. And then I called Frances Haugen, who recently testified in Congress. And I called academics like Jonathan Haidt at NYU, who's written a lot about what it's doing to young kids. And what I learned, and I didn't understand before, was the business plan of the platforms. If you're on the platform, they know everything about you, okay? That's their property. So they use AI algorithms, and it's about to get a lot worse with advanced AI. They use AI to boost to you information to keep you angry and anxious so they can get more money from the ads that they direct to you. They're basically attention advertising companies. That's how they make their money. And I'm a capitalist. I'm all for people making money. Okay? But if a company is making money by behavior that is harming children, our national security, or polarizing the American people, then we need to do something about it. First is public education, so that people know that they're being addicted to these phones. We're told that young kids sometimes spend 5, 6, 7 hours a day addicted to the phone. Secondly, we've got to do something about the polarization, because if we talk about Congress being dysfunctional, people say to me, Congress is pretty dysfunctional. I say, yeah, it kind of is, but don't blame it on the members. Congress is a reflection of the American people. As he just said, you're the sovereign. You run the show. Jack Kennedy once said, when talking about the House of Representatives, he said, "Here, sir, the people govern." Self-government. So if the people are bitterly polarized, Congress is going to be bitterly polarized. So looking at all this, a bunch of us have set up something we call the Council for Responsible Social Media. And we've recruited now 55 people onto it. Some former public servants, like Reed, is part of it. We have mainly, though, people from the platforms who tried to reform them or get them to behave differently. And, of course, they were turned down because it would hurt their profits. So they couldn't do that. And we've got academics. We've got mothers. We have 2 mothers whose kids killed themselves because of being bullied and disparaged on social media. And we are working as hard as we know how to get some laws passed, regulations passed that both sides can embrace that would bring about better behavior on the part of the platforms. Now, for full disclosure, there's a thing called Section 230, which you may have never heard of, but we passed it in the early 90s or late 80s, and it exempted the platforms from legal liability for putting out libelous information. I don't know if you've noticed, but newspapers can be sued if they put out libelous information that they know is incorrect. So can TV stations, not social media platforms. And their argument to us, and I voted for it, their argument to us was that you're never going to have an industry on the internet if you don't exempt us from liability. And these were little bitty nothing companies at the time. So we bought that argument. And they also said, we're a dumb pipe. We don't produce any content. The people produce the content. Well, excuse me, you're the most intelligent pipe in the history of the world. You're boosting to people things to make them angry and upset. And that's why I think the American people, it's not only that, but this is a significant cause. I believe the American people are about as polarized today as they were in 1860. So we got to do something about it, and we got to do it together.
You know, the interesting thing is when social media first came on the landscape, and again, for full disclosure, in a few weeks I'm going to be 68 years old, so I was...
He's young.
I lived many years prior to computers and the internet and social media. But the idea there was that people could communicate with each other directly. They could say what they wanted to say, they could communicate directly, and news could be almost instantaneous. And so there were a lot of good things that happened with platforms like Twitter, because if something's going on in Iran, if there's a revolution on Tiananmen Square, through the power of that media, the world could know about it, and those that would create censorship would have to deal with what was going on, because they could post video and it could happen in real time. And so how do you take something that has all this benefit, whereas you don't have to get news from some commentator and their opinion of it, you can kind of create your own? How do we make sure that we don't just create platforms of misinformation and disinformation, and how people can use and companies can use the algorithms for their benefit, but at your hurt? And it's really difficult. I liken this very much to the gun debate going on in our country right now. We have a First Amendment right to free speech with very few restrictions. There are some, but very few restrictions. In fact, as a matter of fact, the First Amendment starts with these words: Congress shall make no law. That's pretty powerful. So protecting that. And so there's a constitutional liberty that is at stake. So it's important that as we look at social media, with its pros and cons, that any regulation we get it right. That we actually get it right. And it's going to be very, very difficult to do. And I've seen this thing morph in my lifetime. I mean, I'm wondering, I'll look at my Twitter feed and say, where the heck did that come from? And some algorithm, someplace decided that I needed to see it. And sometimes it spins me up, and sometimes not. Sometimes I just laugh at it. But this is a big challenge for our society. It's a big challenge for a free society to figure out how we can maintain freedom and liberty that we so much cherish while having restraint on things that we know can be harmful. There's a lot of smart people working on this, and I'm anxious at some point to hear what you folks have to say. I think it can be helpful to the
Reed,
dialogue.
on the point of information, can you talk a little bit about misinformation around the 2020 election? I think it would be really powerful for people to hear your views, which I think deviate from what a lot of people within the Republican Party think about that. And you talked about it in my class. You and I spent 30 minutes over coffee talking about it the other day. And could you just talk about like misinformation on that and why
Yeah.
you think it circulates and
Sure.
what's wrong?
I'll speak to it, but I want to hear Dick because he's like 3 times smarter than I am. But here's the reality. My dad had a saying when I was a kid, and I was a roofing contractor before I went into Congress, and roofing contractors don't always have the best reputation. And my dad said to me about some of my competition, remember that it is way easier to scam somebody than it is to convince somebody that they've been scammed. In many respects, the 2020 presidential election, a lot of people were scammed into thinking that it wasn't legit, when in fact it was. I remember writing an op-ed weeks and weeks before the election because I was fearful, because there was so much conversation about, well, if I lose, it's rigged. And I was concerned because I knew here in the state of Wisconsin that mail-in ballots don't get counted until after the polls close. And in that case, it's very likely, given that Democrat voters were more inclined to mail-in ballots than Republican voters are more inclined to vote on the day of the election, that President Trump could be winning at one point during the day, and then when all these mail-in ballots got counted, if there was a lack of trust in the system, that all of a sudden President Biden or at the time, candidate Biden becomes president of the United States. And it could sow in all kinds of doubt. And if you were willing to push that out there and put things out there, people would automatically believe it. And then there's an entire ecosystem that starts to push it further through talk radio and conservative media and what have you. And I watched this thing spin out of control. And yet I wanted people, and the reason I wrote that op-ed that I started talking about was that people would trust their neighbor. If you don't trust a politician, trust your neighbor. Because when you go to your polling station, who's there? Usually it's a senior citizen, and it's usually a neighbor. Literally, in my district in Sherwood, it was my next door neighbor. And they were at the polls, and they were making sure that your ID was checked off the list, and it gave you the ballot and made sure it got entered in the machine to be tabulated correctly. And there are thousands and thousands of precincts. The idea that you could scam the system is virtually impossible. And yet, that's what people were told over and over and over and over again, until the ultimate result is what happened on January 6th, where people were really, really mad. And if you believed it, if you actually believed it, you had a right to be mad. If it were true, you had a right to be mad. But what happens when it's not true? And then how do you get that back? How do you rebuild trust in a system that worked exactly as it was intended? This is the challenge of the age. Now, interestingly enough, in 2022, other than the candidate for governor in Arizona who lost, everybody seemed to just accept that it was A-OK. I wonder why that happened. Because there wasn't somebody out telling you every single day, if I lose, it's got to be rigged. And sometimes you want to believe something so deeply. You just really want to believe it, that you just believe it. And boy, it's tough to unwind that clock. But the 2020 presidential election was not rigged. And there were great Americans, volunteers, tens of thousands of them, in every precinct across this great land, who gave up their time for no pay, and in some cases at great risk to their own lives, to see that your vote counted and that it mattered. And no one should be able to take it away. Dick?
I agree with everything he said. It's a lot easier to break trust than to build it. Our democracy, our country, is based on trust of the process. The story I told you earlier about people being willing to grudgingly accept results they really didn't like because they trusted the process. They trusted its fairness. So once you drive at that trust and you break it, we're in big trouble. We have to restore it. We have to retain it. We have to educate and inform people of how the process works. Part of the problem is the process is opaque. Not because anybody wants it to be opaque. It's just, it is what it is. It's complicated. I ran 14 times for the House. I was in touch with the election officials all the time. I know how they did things. But I didn't even understand it.
Yeah.
I didn't know all the steps they had to take to make sure that it was all done on the up and up. Let's go back to 2020 for a minute. We missed having a broken election by 1 inch. Why did we avoid that? A handful of people, Republicans and Democrats, election officials, secretaries of state, what have you, who, when the chips were down, were being encouraged to do something that they knew in their heart and their mind was wrong. And they didn't do it. Mike Pence, who I served with, probably disagree with him on lots of things. When the chips were down, he put country over self. He did. He was what Jack Kennedy would call a profile in courage. He maintained our trust in the process. So we've got to fix this problem. And the reason I'm in Wisconsin, we were in Eau Claire last night, La Crosse this morning, we're here tonight. We're going to have some other meetings with some other members of our Keep Our Republic tomorrow with citizens here. We're trying to encourage citizens, bipartisan citizens, to help restore trust to all people in Wisconsin that this process in 2024 will be valid, will be competent, and will be trusted. And Wisconsin is a very important part of this whole picture. I don't know whether some of you know this, but I was told today by someone who knows a lot about the history of the state that, 100 years ago, Wisconsin was seen as the model of being able to have valid elections. Other states looked at the process that Wisconsin followed. If Wisconsin can't do it, probably a lot of other states can't do it. So you all are in a very pivotal position, and you all can be involved in making sure that we have valid elections going forward and that people can trust the process.
You know, one of the things that makes the system so trustworthy is its opaqueness. It's hard to scam a system that is so diverse as our election system in the U.S. because there's 50 states, and those states get to run their own elections the way they choose to run them. Very little federal law, and it's appropriate that there's very little federal law because it is in that diversity of methodologies that make it very difficult to cheat it. And one word about Mike Pence. When I was elected to Congress, every single new member, at least this is how it was done when I was elected, Dick, was assigned a mentor for 6 months. And we would meet every Wednesday with our mentor. Mike Pence was mine. I was assigned to Congressman Mike Pence to be my mentor. So I met with Mike a lot. And what he did on January 6th was totally within the character of the man that I saw when I served with him in Congress. But the most significant thing I think that he did that day was refuse to leave the Capitol. He knew that they had to finish the count. This was a point of law. He had to finish the count, and he refused to stay there. And between Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader McConnell, they were demanding that the Capitol Police and the D.C. Police get control of the Capitol so they could go back into session. Many members of Congress never believed they were going to do it, and Pence wasn't going to leave. And that is an amazing thing, because it would have been very simple for him to just let the security detail that he had at the Secret Service grab him and whisk him away. That would have been a very normal thing. His wife was there. His family was there. But he stayed. It's an incredible act of patriotism. And so, Aaron?
I want to just ask one question before we jump to audience Q&A. We've got a lot of people in the audience who are college students. They might be thinking of getting involved in politics or public service at some point in their life. And most of the stuff you talked about was bad stuff or concerns you have, and that could be intimidating. What would your advice be to somebody who's toying with the idea of getting involved in politics or public service, but is scared of some of the negative things like the lack of trust, the misinformation, constant attacks? What would you say?
At the core of it, it's a people problem. So if you are a good person, our country needs you. That's what I would say.
Just do it. Don't even worry about it. Do it. When I came out of law school, I came back to where I'd grown up, the neighborhood, and I'd seen Jack Kennedy. He was president when I was in college. And I thought, boy, he's the model of a public servant. So I wanted to get into politics, and I knew no one. Neither of my parents went to high school. So I asked somebody in the neighborhood, I said, how do you get in politics? They said, well, you got to go to the local Democratic organization or the local Republican organization. So I thought, well, Kennedy was a Democrat, so I'm going to go to the Democratic organization. So I show up, and the precinct captain, the committeeman's there, and he was the clerk of the circuit court. And he said, what are you doing here, young man? And I said, I just want to volunteer. He said, what's wrong with you? And I said,
That was a legitimate question.
are you nuts? And I said, no, I just want to volunteer. He said, okay. You got the second precinct. That's your precinct. You're the precinct captain. He said, your job is to go door to door and meet everybody in the precinct. Try to figure out if the person you've talked to is a D or an R or an independent. Mark it down on the list. On election day, go to the polling place, hand out our ballot. There'll be a Republican handing out their ballot. And at 4 o'clock, if anybody you've identified as a probable D hasn't voted, then get in your car and go out and encourage them to come in and vote. Politics will never change. It's that. It's the people. That's how I got started in politics. You can do the same thing. If you're interested, when I left law school, a lot of my classmates said, oh, if you're interested in politics, you got to go to D.C., you got to work for a congressperson, blah, blah, blah. I said, no, I want to start at the bottom. I want to understand what this is and how it works. So I went to the lowest possible level and learned it from the ground up. few years later, I ran for city council. Was there 5 years, and then after that, my member of Congress retired, and I went off on a fool's errand and ran for Congress, and everybody said I didn't have a chance, and I didn't. But I went door to door for a year, 12 hours a day. I met everybody that I could, and I eked out a victory. That's politics. There's a lot more money in it now than there should be, and a lot of other challenges, but you just got to dive in to the pool and make it work. Democracy requires good volunteers, and that's what you are. That's what you are. And if we don't get them, we're not going to have a healthy democracy.
I'm going to come get the wireless mic and circulate around. So if you have questions, put those hands up, and I'll try to keep tabs on the order.
I'm optimistic, but I see that our country is divided more now than I've ever seen it, at least. So what steps do you think we as a country need to take to move forward as a unified body instead of two warring parties?
Well, there's a lot of things that come to mind. I mean, we've talked about social media, which is a significant part of the problem, and we've got to get our arms around that. And if you become despondent about that, I just urge you to look at the fact that we've had challenges like this before and we've overcome them. Tobacco. Similar kind of problem, right? It took 60 years to get progress on stopping people from smoking. I worked with Dick Durbin for over a year to get a bill passed in Congress back in I think it was the 80s, to prohibit smoking on international flights. Forget domestic flights. We lost 3 times.
Yeah, for you college students, you used to be able to smoke on an airplane.
Yeah. Yeah, you could smoke on airplanes. And they had a smoking section and a non-smoking section, as if the smoke wouldn't go to the non-smoking section. So that's how long it took. We don't have that kind of time on social media, in my view. So it's a significant problem. And to give you some optimism, I was at a hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee last week, and we had 2 of our council members there, 2 mothers whose kids had killed themselves. The main hearing was about harm to kids, but it went off into all the other problems. Every member of that panel, Republicans and Democrats, Lindsey Graham, Josh Hawley from my state, lots of other Republicans, lots of Democrats, they all said the same thing. We are going to do something about this. Lindsey Graham called me in his office after the hearing. He said, Dick, we are on this. We are going to get something done this year. So that's a big one. In addition to that, we've got the people have to maintain respect with one another. And it's really as simple as that. I mean, you know, Democrats are all mad at the Trumpers. They don't want to deal with Trumpers. They don't want to live where they live. They don't want to talk to them. They don't want to listen to them. And a lot of people on the right wing of the Republican Party don't want to talk to the wacko liberals and listen to their baloney. We can't do that. I have to respect you no matter what you think. I need to listen to you. It doesn't mean I have to agree with you. But you have an equal right that I have to have a view of anything. So open up and talk to people that you know you disagree with vehemently and listen to them. Show them respect. You'll be surprised at the reaction you'll get. when you know somebody, you can't hate them. Okay? You can disagree, but you can figure out a way to do it agreeably.
I would start with you and your sphere of influence. Be the example you hope that you want to see from others. But beyond that, I think we're probably within a decade or maybe just a little bit longer before the American people wrestle control back themselves. And that may mean breaking the duopoly of the two political parties that are currently in power and having a third independent party that's someplace in this group in the middle. When I was in Congress, I often had 10% of the very hard left screaming in one ear and 10% of the very hard right screaming in the other, and virtually everybody else telling me, just go to D.C. and do your job, and I trust you. And there's going to come a time where the American people are going to say enough, and they're going to break it and break the mold and say, we don't want this anymore. And but we certainly don't need the anger. But I think we have a tendency to simplify it too much by saying we've got a red-blue divide. Republicans and Democrats can't get along. What we really have is an urban-rural divide in the country. And there's a general lack of respect for each other. People that live in rural communities don't respect urban dwellers and vice versa. And we have to begin to recognize that in a country like ours that is so big and so diverse, that there will be lots and lots, and there ought to be lots and lots of room for people to choose where, how, and with whom to live. And I do believe that we're going to end up in that place. And it might look different than the current system that we have as far as how and who gets elected and how much power political parties have. Remember, political parties are there, in part, their primary objective is to maintain and hold on to power. And so what we want to do is somehow get the power back to people. So.
I wish we had more time. I'm looking at the sign International Earth Day, April 22nd. I've always been a Republican, kind of a liberal Republican. I like Jack Kennedy as well, and I voted for Gaylord Nelson and Bill Proxmire because I believe they're good people and they had the interest of the country at heart.
And I
But-
think you were probably smart enough to vote for me.
I did.
Okay.
I think I might even. I think I might even have canceled checks with your name on it. But what really bothers me is the Supreme Court issue. I was a political science student 60 years ago, and economics as well. And when I listen to politicians talk about the Supreme Court and other aspects of government, it's strange to me. It's like that's not the way we were. I learned back then. My wife would tell me that I was probably talking when they were talking about that subject. But the case of Roe versus Wade. I get together with a bunch of guys. We've been doing it for 40 years. And they got on the subject of abortion and Roe versus Wade. And I said, I'm going to read that case. I've seen a summary of it. I'm going to read it. And there was one justice, if I recall correctly, that said, I am anti-abortion. I do not support abortion. But my job is to rule on the Constitution of the United States and look at the facts and apply that logic. And right now we're in the throes of an election for Supreme Court in the state of Wisconsin, and you watch all this stuff on TV, it's like, well, this judge said this or ruled this way, and it's like, I don't think that's really the role of a Supreme Court justice at the state level or the national level. The role is to decide whether or not regulations and law are contrary to our Constitution. And it just seems like people are just buying into all this stuff, and it kind of galls me. And it goes to the same issue that you were talking about before. I'm right, you're wrong, there's no middle ground. I had a political science professor that said back in the 60s, the system works because on the political continuum, it's the people in the middle that make the rules, not the extremists. And I don't really see where we've got the people in the middle negotiating and making the rules. So, you know, and there's a lot of people that are young in here, and I think that's, if there's one thing that'll bring down this country is not being able to communicate and see the other person's side and say, you know, I really don't like this, but I will compromise for the benefit of the country and for my constituents. You know, I'm not right, you're not all wrong, there's got to be some middle ground. You know, you said it before, the system is nobody's really happy at the end, totally happy. But they should be happy that they've done something for our country.
Exactly.
I would say, have you ever been to the U.S. Capitol building?
Yes.
Okay, so if you've ever had a tour of the U.S. Capitol building, the original Supreme Court chamber was under, kind of in the basement underneath the Senate chamber. And the Senate wanted them there because they wanted the Supreme Court under the heel of the Congress. Because the Supreme Court wasn't to legislate. But now we want many citizens want the Supreme Court to legislate. They don't like the result of the legislation, or they don't like the result of what the president's done. They want the Supreme Court to change it. And the Supreme Court ought to be mostly irrelevant in our lives. That's just my take.
What if you had to elect the referees at the Green Bay Packers game?
Yeah.
Okay? That's the analogy. We are on the way to politicizing the courts. And once you're there, then you're in a bad place because they have to be referees. They are not policymakers.
Right. That's right.
They are there to interpret the Constitution as it applies to a certain set of facts. That's their mission. They got to know the rules of the NFL, of a football game, and apply those rules to whatever is happening in the game. And so that's a real worry. I don't know a lot about your Supreme Court race here. We do it differently in Missouri. We have the governor pick from a slate that's produced by a blue ribbon lawyers committee, and no politics gets in it at all. Not supposed to. And then they appoint the judges, and then you only get a crack at them as the public every 12 years or something. Do you want to retain Judge so-and-so or not? But this is a corrosive process. I mean, I heard figures of how much money is being spent on this race. It's just
shocking.
Outlandish.
It's shocking.
So there are things you can do to beef up the process to make it work better, but that's a real concern.
Aaron, there's a question up over here in the back.
Hi there. The other day in Dr. Weinstein's class, Congressman Ribble mentioned how he had 231 cosigns for a bill, and within 24 hours, 70 members have dropped out. Do you believe there is corruption in Congress, and if so, how prevalent is it?
Do I believe there's corruption there? Is that the question, how prevalent it is? Corruption's a tough word to kind of zoom in on. What he's talking about, Dick, is I had offered an amendment to the highway bill to allow heavier trucks to drive on the interstate system with an additional axle and brakes. Had broad bipartisan support, and within 24 hours, Big Rail came in and just shut that thing down. Peeled off a lot of votes, so it couldn't happen. But I wouldn't say that the system was corrupt. Those members of Congress did that openly and in public. I mean, their name was on the amendment as a co-sponsor, and they chose to vote differently because they got different information, or information that was more persuasive than the information I gave them. So I don't necessarily call it corrupt, but I will call it pretty powerful.
Yeah, I think at some point we need to reconsider how we finance campaigns. I want there to be freedom. I don't want to, be terribly restrictive. The really good news to me is that now candidates can raise money on the internet. Couldn't do that because we didn't have the internet when I was running. but that's a big deal. And you know, I don't know if it'll work, but what's wrong with a candidate going to the public that he's trying to run with or in front of and say, I'm just voluntarily only going to take money from people, and it's going to be limited to X. And if you want to control your members and not have special interest to it, then send me $5. My opponent may not do it, but I'm going to do it. And see if it works. I mean, that might work in today's world, where people can actually send you $5 by hitting a button on their phone.
I was a big advocate when I was there of trying to pass some regulation whereby you couldn't receive PAC money from any corporation with whom had business on the committees of jurisdiction. So if I was on the Ag Committee, farmers couldn't support me or agriculture couldn't support me. If you're on the Finance Committee, maybe bankers and stock market couldn't. So that you could separate the legislation from any type of financial support. There's things like that. We definitely need to get campaign finance reform done because it has now gotten to be such a big money game. I think it was my second election that there was over $3 million spent on a small congressional seat in northeast Wisconsin. At the time, that was an astronomical amount of money. How much money did it cost for your first election?
I had a tough primary and a tough general election, and I spent the grand total of $70,000. And I raised it all from family and friends who didn't have a lot of money. Things have changed.
Yeah. Yep.
When I'm looking at media and talking with other classmates, one of the biggest proposed solutions I see at the moment is the idea of introducing either term limits or age limits to the Congress. I just want to know your guys' thoughts as two different guys who have both served in different parties to know what your thoughts are on the concept of term limits or age limits in the Congress.
I have, first of all, I think I'm beginning to believe there needs to be an age limit. And I hate to say that because I'm really old now. And I don't want age discrimination. I get it. But, you know, we've got some folks that are in Congress who are really not as sharp as they should be. And that isn't good. I served on 5 public boards since I've been in Congress, and they all had age limits.
Mm-hmm.
I've aged off all the boards, and it was fine. It's always hard with human beings to get people off the stage. None of us wants to face our inevitable demise, right? So we don't want to leave. And there's good things about people not leaving because with age comes knowledge and experience, and I'm for that. But there has to be a happy medium in my view. On term limits, I'm a more mixed mind. Let me just tell you two stories. Legislation can get really complicated, and you need members who really dig in and understand the ins and outs. When I would try to write a bill, I'd go to Legislative Council, and they'd always say to me, yeah, that's a nice idea, but you've got to look at how it affects all the different people in the country. It's complicated. I did tax reform with Bill Bradley back in the early 80s. And boy, when I got into the detail of how this tax provision would affect these people and it would affect those, you really have to work it and think about it and spend time on it. I saw John Dingell, who was chairman of the Commerce Committee for years, write the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And he did it totally bipartisan. He listened to every member of that committee and put that legislation together. That came from experience. That came from doing it over and over and over again. So maybe there's a happy medium there that you could reach. To this man's great credit, he decided that he would be there for X amount of time, and then he stepped away. I have great admiration for that. In a different way, that's what I did. I decided when I hit 65 years old that I wanted to go do something else. And so I was lucky to be able to do that because I've lived longer. But there has to be some happy medium. We got to bring in the young people. And they have to figure it out. And they've got fresh ideas, and they have optimism, and they have motivation. And we need that.
Just because I term limited myself, and I did, and I walked away voluntarily, and I walked away in a year that I had no opponent. There was nobody running against me when I walked away. Does not mean I think it should be mandated on everyone. So to be clear, there is a term limit. There is a date certain that the Congress term ends. It's 2 years long, and it ends. The American people can choose to term limit virtually anybody they wish. And to a certain degree, I much prefer that the American people make that decision. You can say, well, the system is so benefits an incumbent. And listen, in the 2022 midterm, 100% of U.S. incumbent senators that ran for re-election won. That's an astounding number when you ask people, what do you think about Congress? They all hate Congress. Well, everybody hates Congress, but they really hate the other guy's congressperson. They love their own. And so they don't like the way Congress works because it feels clumsy and it looks so dysfunctional, and there's so much vitriol in political campaigns. But the American people, I prefer them to be the sovereign one deciding that. And quite frankly, if you look at the data, the average length of time someone serves in the U.S. House of Representatives is 10 years. The average length of time someone serves in the U.S. Senate is 12. So there is a cadre of people that serve much longer. And as long as they don't do what happened to me, kind of pat the young guy on the head and say, leave it to the pros, I think I would rather leave that to the American people to decide rather than dictating it.
Is it possible that some of the increasing polarization and inability to compromise on issues go past politics? Because right now we've got income inequality at almost record levels, and a guy named Robinson theorized that people who are suffering often try to break a system entirely rather than selecting a new leader or try and reform it. And how would you even go about trying to fix that?
It is a tough question. Since I was in Congress, I dealt a lot with companies and unions. My dad was a Teamster and a truck driver. He lost that job when his back gave out, and he never had another job. So I always appreciated the contribution of unions in Congress. They weren't always right, no more than anybody's always right. But I saw a role that unions could play in getting people fair compensation. Around the dinner table at night, my dad would always say, you have clothes on your back and food at the table, because I was represented by a union that could get me fair wages for my hard work. And he worked hard. He went to work at 3 a.m, cracked the ice over the milk bottles, and then took it door to door back in the day. So that's kind of waned. Unions are not in good order, and so they've kind of fallen away, and that's, I think, part of the problem. We've also entered a world economy, and that has had an impact. I happen to think that world trade is ultimately very good, not only for other countries to get their standard of living up, but for us having, customers all over the world rather than just in the United States. And I think in today's world with our transportation and communications, you have to have trade. Now we'll have a big, fight over what's fair trade as opposed to free trade, and that's a legitimate set of questions. And I often entered into that debate because I thought back in the 80s that our system wasn't fair vis-a-vis Japan, who, basically took a lot of our automobile manufacturing over to Japan, and our workers got left without a job. So that affected standard of living. Incidentally, the trade bill we passed, and then with what Ronald Reagan did, we brought a lot of those jobs back, but the Japanese manufacturers came here and built plants all over the United States. So there's a way to balance those scales that helps. But the last thing I'll say is that ultimately it's not unions and it's not trade laws. It's the way people run businesses, and that has to be their own decision. And I work with CEOs every day, and what I tell them is your job, your most important job, is to get 100% discretionary effort from every employee, including the janitor. And if you get that, everybody wins. You will make more money, your investors will do better, and the employees will be happier and make more money. And a lot of them do that. Some of them don't do that. They don't care about that. And ultimately, that's where things have to go if we're to erase this huge gap between the managers, the CEOs, and the employees.
There are literally a handful of what I would call the uber rich in the U.S., a couple thousand people out of 330 million. And is it a problem? Well, sure, it's a problem. I'm not sure that I've seen anything within our constitutional system that makes me feel comfortable to address it. And we could say, well, we should unionize every worker, and their pay might go up by $10 an hour. That won't even move the needle against somebody that's making billions of dollars a year. It won't affect any change. In fact, the idea of income inequality has been right at the forefront of the political debate for well over 100 years, dating back to the Carnegies and Vanderbilts who built an empire on Braille. And it's a stunningly difficult problem to deal with. However, there are more people moving from the middle class to the upper class and from the lower class to the middle class than ever before. We're actually moving people out of poverty and into a better style of living. And so it's a difficult problem. I'll share with you a comment I gave to President Raul Castro when I was in Cuba, because he complained to me about the very same thing and criticized capitalism because of it. And the reality is they've got a system there where they've chosen to deal with it by making everybody poor. And I don't know that that is a good opposite of what we have. So it's difficult in a free market system, and it feels unfair that someone could be so wealthy. It feels unfair that the CEO of Amazon makes as much money, and yet everybody in this room buys from Amazon. In essence, how we choose to spend our money creates part of the problem that we're trying to fix. You can choose to buy something from a local mom and pop shop right here in Green Bay and not buy from Amazon, but we choose to buy from Amazon. And we choose to buy from big corporations all the time. We go to Walmart, we go to all kinds of places. And that free market system allows people in lower income levels to help elevate themselves and also buy things at better pricing for themselves. I know that is a very unsatisfying answer to a very complex question. And I apologize for it being unsatisfactory, but I get it. And so I realize it's unsatisfactory.
Hey there. I just kind of wanted to ask a question because earlier you guys brought up Section 230, which, as I understand, provides these platforms with certain protections and exempts them from being publishers. So if anything illegal goes on a social media website, it's basically not their fault. But what I feel like I've noticed in recent years is they are kind of being discriminatory in what they do allow on and off. And I was wondering if there is any efforts being made to reform Section 230, because technically these are private companies and they're allowed to do this. And do you think the state should take like a more crucial role in this, like something like the Bell Telecommunications Act, or is it kind of just up to the free market?
The hard part of trying to fix 230 is that when you get into saying, well, you're going to be liable if you behave this way, but you won't be liable if you behave that way, is you get into all these freedom of speech issues, which are really difficult and are hard to resolve. And you really, at the end of the day, you can't resolve it. The platforms tell you that they're doing content moderation. That's a fool's errand, in my view, because it gets you into all these censorship arguments that a lot of Republicans make. They think that Facebook is taking their stuff off and leaving the liberals on. And even if they tried to do good content moderation, just understand. I mean, when the newspapers had editors that did curation of information, that's what they did. How many stories that they have to deal with? These platforms have millions and billions of posts coming on a day. They'd have to hire half the people in the world to moderate everybody else's posts. It's not going to happen. The things that we're really looking at are protecting kids, which there's a lot of controversy over how to do that. Some people say that anybody 16 or under can't be on their phone. They can't be on the internet. Well, good luck with that. That's how we communicate. But there are other things they could do within their software and the way the thing operates to give kids more privacy, or to allow their parents and the kids together to create more privacy. On the question of national security, there's pretty good bipartisan agreement that we shouldn't let the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese play in our platforms to divide us, to defeat us. And you can get pretty good bipartisan agreement about that. On the rest of it, I think there's greater merit in looking at transparency so that we know how they're operating their algorithms. And the least of that would be to give advertisers more information on where their ads are going, so the advertisers could have more power over where their ads show up. And then the last thing is maybe the most important, and that is kind of the cause of the problem. And that is their ability to take away your privacy. And I think you might be able to get bipartisan agreement about that, because everybody thinks we ought to have privacy if we want it. So there's legislation out there that says that they have to give you privacy almost by default. You have to opt in to let them get your information. So those are the kind of things we're looking at and talking about. Our council, nobody elected us to anything. I mean, we're just volunteers. But we're trying to help. And so we're interacting with members of Congress, with their staff, just trying to help from the sidelines get our arms around this very, very tough and important problem. As Tristan Harris told me one day, he said, we have to have freedom of speech, but the Constitution does not guarantee freedom of reach, which is what the algorithms do.
I mean, it's a hugely complex problem. It's a hugely complex problem. And there's a lot of really bright people working on it. We'll just have to continue to work on it. Hopefully we'll get it right. Probably make a bunch of mistakes along the way.
Took 60 years to do tobacco.
Right.
Welcome to Green Bay. If you give me 10 seconds to frame up my question, because I'm having a weird out of body tonight, because I saw you speak when I was a young idealist in 1988. You were running for president at the time. I was an idealist when I had a professor, a young student of mine in my 9th grade class, and I sit here next to one of my current students, in many of my government classes, I used you as an example of a trustee, because you would make Democrats mad and you'd make Republicans mad, because you were able to stand in the middle. Do you think that's still possible today? And if you could tell a bit of advice to a new politician, how do you stay out of the fray with primarying and Citizens United and just social media? Is it possible, and what would you say they should do to stay in what I think is a trustee that could save, that enlightened statesperson that could save our country?
Well, let me tell you 2 stories to explain. In 1990, I was majority leader, and George H.W. Bush was president. And he kept saying to our leadership in both the Republican and Democratic Party, we need to have a summit. We got to get the budget under control. The deficit is getting way too big. And we agreed. And he said, we need a budget summit. You need to bring the Senate and the House together with the White House people, and we need to figure it out. And we said, we're happy to do that. Is everything on the table? And he said, everything but taxes. He said, I made a pledge when I got nominated in Houston, I think it was, that read my lips, no new taxes. And he said, I can't do taxes. So we said, we understand, but we don't think we should have a summit unless everything's... We're not saying we're going to raise taxes. We got to come to a compromise. We got to come to an agreement, but we can't even start that if that's off the table. It would be like taking spending off the table. He said, well, we can't do it. We had 3 more meetings, same dialogue, same result. He finally invited us to dinner in the Oval Office. And he looked at us and he said, okay, I get the joke. I'm putting everything on the table. And he handed a press release to Marlon Fitzwater, his press guy. He said, put it out. So we go out behind the White House. We're waiting for the cars to come pick us up. And George Bush is standing next to me, and he's going foot to foot, back and forth. I said, Mr. President, what's wrong? He said, the fat's in the fire. I've always cited that story for an example of leadership. Leadership is taken on your own side, not the other side. And I ask members a lot to do that, to get compromises through. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. And they'd say to me, I should vote for this, but I won't get reelected. And I would say, why did you come here? Did you come here for this stupid job? Or did you come here to make the country better? For the people that trusted you to come here. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. The test for anybody wanting to be in public service is to always try to put country over party, and more importantly, country over self. You're not there for yourself. You're there for the people. And if you make a vote that's going to hack off 50 or more % of your people, go home and explain it. And if they still want to get rid of you, it's okay. Go do something else. But it's okay. One last story. So We made big strides. We got that deal done with George H.W. Bush. And incidentally, he was a fabulous president. I loved George H.W. Bush. I also liked his son. And that's a whole nother story that I don't have time to tell you. But the other story is that after Clinton came in 1992, we still held a majority in the House. And he invited the leaders, the Democratic leadership, down to Little Rock, and we had dinner with Bill Clinton and Hillary. And he said, what should be our big priorities? And I said, Mr. President, I know that Democrats want to do health care, and they want to do education, they want to do this, that, and the other thing. I said, we really worked our cans off to get this change in the budget. We made big progress, but now we have to balance the budget. And that's what we need to do. Hillary said, no, I think we ought to do health care, which she wanted to do, and that was a good thing to do too. But I said we can't do two big things at what we can do one thing at a time. And this is going to take at least a year. He said, I agree with Dick. That's what we're going to do. So we went to work. We had all the committee chairs. We had all the ranking members, House and Senate, meet together by committee first, and then put all the pieces together. Long story short, we're not getting it done. Can't come to agreement. We had the press coming up to people saying, we hear you're going to cut Medicare. Are you going to cut Medicare? No, I'd never cut Medicare. You going to cut Social Security? Oh, no, I'd never cut Social Security. I said to the president, we're not going to have any votes. This is going to be over before we get started. So I said, we got to get these people off the campus. So we took all the committee chairs, all the ranking members, all the White House people out to Andrews Air Force Base. And we kept working the problem. We got the bill done. We take it to the floor. I knew we weren't going to get many Republican votes because we had the House, we had the Senate, we had Bill Clinton. So I had to get most every vote from my side. I went to every member and I said, you got to vote for this. This is, we're right on the cusp of balancing this budget. And they'd say, I can't do it because I won't get elected. There's a 3-cent gasoline tax increase in it. So finally, it came down. I needed 20 more votes. We didn't have them. And Clinton called me and said, when are you going to run this vote? And I said, I don't know if I have the votes. He said, well, time's up. We got to go. So we ran the vote. And at the end of the vote, we're tied, which means you lose. And I told a lot of the freshmen who did not want to vote for it because they knew they couldn't win their election, please wait. Don't go vote early. Just wait and see where we are because I don't know where we are. So at the end of the vote, we're tied. There was one freshman who did not vote. Marjorie Mezvinsky. Marjorie Margolis Mezvinsky from suburban Philly. She was in a Republican district. And she had told me, if I have to vote for this, I'm gone. So I walked over to her. Everybody was watching. Tom Foley was with me. We looked at her and we said, you got to vote for this. This is it. It's not about you. It's not about us. Not about Clinton. It's about the country. She walked down, plopped down her green card. Republicans stood in the aisles and waved bye-bye Marjorie. She lost the next election because of that vote. That's country over self. She went on to teach at the University of Pennsylvania political science, and every year she'd bring her class to Washington. She'd call me and she'd say, would you talk to my class? And I'd say, absolutely. And when they came, I would say, your teacher, your professor is my hero of democracy. You're in the presence of greatness because of what she did. What I also told her before she walked down the aisle, I said, We will do everything we can to help you, but you have to go home and explain your vote to the people. And that's my answer to your question. If you're going to do things that a lot of your people hate, they have to believe in you, like the people here believed in him, even though he did a lot of things that made them very angry because they knew him. They trusted him to be making a decision that was in everybody's benefit, including them, because that's his job. That's the job of a representative, is to make the best decision you can make. I made all kinds of mistakes, not by motivation, not by intent, because I didn't know enough. But I was able to go home and explain things to people, and they continued to trust me. And that's the name of the game.
I'm going to add just one thing, because you brought up Citizens United, and I've been a little surprised it took as long as it did for Citizens United to come up, because it comes up almost all the time. I would say this one thing about Citizens United, and sometimes this gets missed in the discussion. Obviously, Citizens United opened Pandora's box of money, the money coming from everywhere. But what Citizens United also did was they leveled the playing field. Because prior to Citizens United, companies like General Electric, a big, huge behemoth that happens to own MSNBC and NBC, or the Murdoch family who own Fox News, these are for-profit companies, had all the free political speech they wanted. They could take whatever corporate dollars they wanted and say whatever they wanted, and they do, and they continue to do so today. But prior to that Supreme Court decision, Security Roofing, my roofing company in Kaukauna, Wisconsin, had no free speech. If I wanted to take profit from my company and put an ad out on TV that was politically based or was position based, it was against the law for me to do that. But if you were a big corporation, doggone it, you could spend all the money you wanted. What Citizens United said is, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to level the playing field. Any corporation can use their money any way their shareholders will allow them to use it. Now, it's up to the Congress then to write laws in response to that decision. It really wasn't the Supreme Court writing a law. It was the Supreme Court saying, here's what the law is, and here's what the Constitution allows, and so we're going to clarify it. But it created a real problem, and I agree that the problem is there, but this is up to Congress to fix. And we need to demand, see, we keep wanting the court to solve the problem for us. And what we need is Congress to write a piece of legislation that can pass both chambers, get to the magic numbers, 218, 60, and 1. You need 218 votes in the House, 60 votes to send one president to sign it, and they could fix that.
Round of applause to thank our panelists for their time.